Ladies and gentlemen, I need to come clean. There's something I've been hiding from you, something that until now I've been hesitant to tell you, but I think that we're at the point in this relationship where we can be more open with each other. You see, L. Augustine, well, let's just say he's a history buff. I love history because there's a lot we can learn from history, and in this video I want to combine my passions of history and frugality and talk about an interesting moment in history that you're probably aware of called the Great Depression. It was a tragic time in history, a moment of financial hardship for everyone, and there's a lot we can learn about money from the Great Depression. And in this video, I want to share 7 frugal living lessons that we can learn from the Great Depression. And so if you're a history buff like me, you know that in order to understand a huge moment in history, you first need to go back and understand what was happening beforehand. And so the first lesson is debt will eventually catch up to you. Our story begins in 1918. World War I had just come to an end with the victory of the Allied powers. And we enter this decade of economic prosperity called the Roaring Twenties. In the Roaring Twenties was the first time in history when the average person had extra money to spend. And this created the rise of modern consumer culture, where people were buying radios, refrigerators, and vacuum cleaners. We were spending more money than ever, which created this major cultural shift in how we spend our money. Where instead of saving for something like we did in the 1910s, in the 1920s, we could borrow money on credit. And this was commonly known as buy now, pay later. And we fell in love with this idea of buying everything on credit. And the banks were handing out money to everyone. Even 60% of cars were purchased on credit. But as you probably know, when you take on debt, eventually not only do you have to pay back the money, but you also have to pay back interest. And eventually this habit of taking on debt started to catch up to people, and they were unable to pay back their debts, which created many financial problems, ultimately leading to this financial crisis. And at the same time, people were spending more money than ever. They were also investing more money than ever, which leads me to the second lesson. If things seem too good to be true, it's because they are. As people started to make more money and have access to more credit, they were wondering, what should I do with all this wealth? I have a car, I have a radio, why not invest in the stock market? And everyone started to invest in the stock market. And from the years 1922 to 1929, the stock market increased 218%. Everyone started to become rich, investing their own money as well as borrowing money on margin from the banks. People were making more money than ever. Things seemed too good to be true until people started to realize maybe things actually are too good to be true, because this market that increased 218% was extremely overvalued. And everyone realized it and started selling their shares. And on a day known as Black Thursday, the market dropped 11%. Then the following Tuesday, known as Black Tuesday, the market dropped 12%. And overnight, people's financial lives changed. Some stocks became worthless. People lost their life savings and faced an extreme amount of debt. And by 1933, the market lost 90% of its value. And just like it always is, all this hype of the Roaring Twenties was too good to be true. And people entered this new decade extremely broke. And this is the theoretical start to the Great Depression, which leads me to our third lesson: expect good times to eventually end. As we learned, the Roaring Twenties was this time of economic prosperity, where people were spending their money carelessly. Then, in the market crash of 1929, people were in financial ruin. Just like always, all good things must come to an end. And this created the Great Depression, where the market lost 90% of its value in 3 years. The unemployment rate rose to 25%, and banks across the country shut down. People's lives drastically changed and nobody expected it. And whether it's 100 years ago or now, we still have this mindset of when times are good, we spend, don't budget, and don't save for the future. And eventually when times get bad, we're not prepared for it. There's a quote by Warren Buffett that goes, "Only when the tide goes out do you discover who's been swimming naked." People who face the most financial hardship during uncertain times are the people who don't prepare when times are good. And in the Roaring '20s, people were blindsided by the good times and they made so many bad financial decisions and didn't prepare and expect that these good times would eventually come to an end. However, in that moment in history, preparation wasn't necessarily possible, which brings me to the fourth lesson: be careful with where you put your money. Once the Roaring '20s came to an end and we entered this financial crisis, people started to panic and they went to the banks to withdraw all their money. And guess what? It turns out the banks didn't have enough money in reserves to give everyone back their money. And so people got turned away, banks shut down, and people lost their life savings. And back then, there wasn't that much a person could do about it, until eventually, to get Americans to trust the banking system again, something called the FDIC was created that insures depositors' money up to $250,000, basically saying, if you see this logo, your money is safe. And now we have more trust in the banking system, except those conspiracy theorists that don't trust the people that print the money, but still use that money to fund their lives. Anyways, although we do have more trust in the banks, we still have to be careful where we put our money, because this bank run where people end up losing all their money could still happen today. Like, do you remember when FTX declared bankruptcy last year? People lost so much money because they put their money in a place that wasn't secured by the FDIC, but it was insured by this guy. And that guy ended up losing everyone's money. So just be careful with who you trust your money with. So now that we've spoken about the events that led up to the Great Depression, now let's talk about life in the Great Depression. In the fifth lesson of living below your means is the only sustainable way to live. So as I explained earlier, once the Roaring '20s began, there was this major cultural shift in how we spend our money. Where instead of saving for something like they did in the 1910s, in the 1920s, they borrowed money on credit. But once the Great Depression started to begin, we realized that that was no longer sustainable. And in the 1930s, we lived in a state of scarcity. We went from one extreme of excess to the other extreme of scarcity. And I think the lesson to be learned in this is that neither one of these extremes is sustainable. What's sustainable is the middle ground, which is frugality, or living below your means. Living above your means in the long term never works. There's an amazing quote about history that goes, "We learn from history that we do not learn from history." Because if you remember in 2008, we saw the effects again of living above our means in the housing crisis. The only lifestyle that is sustainable in the long term is living below your means. It's not a sexy thing, but as we've seen in history, living above your means is always followed by some financial crisis. But, we'll probably never end up actually learning that lesson. Now, the sixth lesson we learned from life in the Great Depression was no matter how little you have, the power is in what you do with it. During the Great Depression, people were forced in this scarcity mindset where they had to scrutinize every penny they spent and try to make every penny go as far as it possibly can. For example, if you had 40 cents in the 1930s, you could either buy a lunch at a restaurant or a 5-pound bag of potatoes, a loaf of bread, and a half dozen eggs. And if you're trying to make the most out of every penny, you're gonna go this route. You're going to get a lot more meals out of it. And so the lesson of this is that the power of money is not necessarily how much you have, but the power is here with what you do with it. In today's day and age, a big problem that people have with money is they focus so much on how much they're making rather than how to make the money they have go as far as it possibly can. For example, nowadays you can get a meal at a restaurant for $15, or you can make 3 meals for $5 each. But people choose to eat out every single day and then run into financial problems. If you live a frugal life and focus more on how much you're spending rather than how much you're making, you'll be able to do a lot more with your money, just like they did in the Great Depression. Now, this final lesson encompasses many more lessons of the Great Depression, and it's be adaptable. So I like to keep my videos short and to the point. I could list 100 more lessons from the Great Depression, but what I have learned in this industry is that once you go over 13 minutes, people start dipping. And so I'm just going to condense those final 100 frugal living lessons into one, and it's simply be adaptable. As I explained in this video, once the Roaring '20s ended and we entered the Great Depression, people were forced to change their ways. They made their own clothes, cooked at home, and seeked opportunities they could find. People were forced to adapt to these new uncertain times, and that adaptability is what ultimately allowed them to get through the Great Depression. And I think that adaptability is one of the most important financial skills a person can have, because regardless of whatever moment of history you live in, you're going to face some uncertainty in life. You might lose your job, run into some financial burdens, or face an economic downturn. And the thing that's going to get you through those uncertain times is your ability to adapt. And in my opinion, I believe that frugality is this amazing skill that allows us to adapt to the uncertainty of life. And so those are the lessons of the Great Depression. Basically, don't fall for the hype of consumerism or the stock market. Plan for shit to hit the fan and adapt by living a more frugal lifestyle. With that, muchas gracias. Que tenga un buen día. Nos vemos, chicos.